Welcome to Night World. Rishabh Varma considered himself a man of precision. An architect by profession, he found solace in straight lines, mathematical certainty, and the predictability of engineered materials. His life was structured, quiet, and utterly devoid of the chaotic emotional resonance he saw crippling the lives of others. So, when the letter arrived informing him of an inheritance, a massive, remote, and unfinished colonial-era bungalow nestled high in the misty foothills, Rishabh was initially annoyed. Chaos was messy, and ancestral legacies often came steeped in unnecessary sentimental complication. The bungalow, known locally only as the Bramha House, had belonged to his great-uncle, Arjun Varma, a man whose existence was merely a footnote in the family records, accompanied by vague whispers of eccentricity and isolation. The drive up to the location was a jarring departure from Rishabh's familiar, measured city grid. The road became a narrow, overgrown dirt track, flanked by ancient, dripping cedar trees. The air, thick with perpetual fog and the smell of wet earth, was unnaturally still. The Bramha House itself was a monolith of grey stone, its unfinished facade half hidden by creeping vines. It looked less like a home and more like a colossal monument to an unfinished idea. Rishabh pulled his rented car into the crumbling driveway, the silence here heavier than any city noise. It pressed on the eardrums, demanding attention. He stepped out, and the only sound was the damp crunch of gravel beneath his bespoke leather shoes. The key, heavy and antique, grated loudly in the massive oak front door. The interior air was cold, stale, and surprisingly dry for a house in such a damp environment. The entrance hall was vast and empty, its dimensions unnerving. Rishabh, with his architect's eye, immediately sensed the spatial anomaly. The room wasn't just large, it was constructed with an acute, almost unnatural symmetry. The ceiling was domed, the opposing walls perfectly parallel, the angles razor-sharp. He dropped his briefcase, and the sound didn't just echo, it resounded. The thud didn't simply dissipate, it seemed to hang in the air for a second, vibrating, before slowly fading back into the deep silence. It was, he noted professionally, a phenomenon of perfect acoustic design. His great-uncle, Arjun Varma, had been an architect, too, but a radical one, obsessed not with beauty or function, but with acoustic perfection. Rishabh found the first of Arjun's journals in the dusty library, a room with impossibly high ceilings. Arjun's cramped, manic handwriting detailed his life's work. The Bramha House was not built to be lived in, but to be experienced. Arjun believed that sound, specifically, the vibration of human emotion, was never truly lost. He theorized that if a structure could be built with perfect geometry and specific resonant materials, it could act as a filter, a containment chamber, a literal echo chamber for the raw intensity of human feeling. The house was designed to trap and amplify the emotional remnants of its inhabitants. Rishabh scoffed. It was the delusional rambling of a crackpot, a man who had clearly lost his grip on rational engineering. Yet, as he moved deeper into the house, the atmosphere changed. The stairs, built of heavy slate, did not creak, they groaned under his weight, a deep, mournful sound that felt more like a low-frequency vibration than a mechanical complaint. In the master bedroom, which overlooked the misty valley, he found the walls were not plaster, but thin sheets of polished metal hidden beneath ornate wallpaper. He tapped one wall, and the metallic sound was instant, loud, and incredibly complex, like 100 tiny bells ringing simultaneously. That evening, the first echo manifested. Rishabh was in the kitchen, making a simple cup of tea. He accidentally dropped a ceramic mug. It shattered on the slate floor. The crash was deafening, the sound bouncing off the parallel surfaces. He cleaned it up and returned to the living room. 20 minutes later, as he was reading, the sharp, distinct sound of ceramic shattering repeated with perfect fidelity, seemingly originating from the kitchen. It was too precise to be imagination, too clear to be a settling house. It was the exact sound, a memory of the vibration, replaying itself. He stood up, his heart thudding a sudden, frantic rhythm that felt unnervingly loud. He checked the kitchen. Nothing. The floor was clean. The replay escalated from objects to emotions. The next day, while cleaning out a small attic room, Rishabh felt a sudden, profound wave of uncontrollable rage. It wasn't his rage. He was a temperate man. This was a blinding, suffocating fury, directed at an invisible, absent party. He felt his hands clench into fists, his muscles coiling tight, an aggressive snarl pulling at his lips. It was so intense, so foreign, that he actually staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The feeling lasted only 30 seconds, then vanished, leaving him shaking and disoriented. The air in the attic felt heavy, buzzing with residual hostility. He quickly found another journal entry from Rishabh Varma detailing an incident in that very attic. The boy raged. The geometry held it. The room is now saturated with pure, contained fury. A sound that is not heard, but felt. Rishabh realized the house wasn't just echoing sounds, it was echoing feelings. He started documenting the phenomena, the scientific detachment returning as a shield against panic. He discovered the house had zones. The library, with its soft wooden accents, held echoes of deep despair, a crippling lethargy that made movement impossible. The narrow, stone-clad hallway on the second floor contained echoes of intense, physical pain, sharp, stabbing sensations that made him double over without physical cause. The house was a gallery of captured suffering, a symphony of silenced trauma. The terror was not seeing ghosts, but feeling like the ghosts. The house forced him to inhabit the mental anguish of its former inhabitants. The most disturbing discovery was the basement. The entrance was hidden beneath a rug in the laundry room. The basement was circular, lined entirely with a thick, dull black, sound-dampening material, the only room not acoustically reflective. In the center was a single, bolted-down chair. The journal entry regarding the basement was the last one, written in a shaky, almost illegible hand. The resonance grew too strong. The trapped feelings began to coalesce. I needed a drain, a place for the pure, concentrated vibration of horror to collect. The chair is the focus. I can no longer sit there. It is no longer an echo. It is a presence. Rishabh backed away slowly, the deep, dead silence of the basement feeling infinitely more menacing than the echoing chaos above. He locked the door and vowed never to return. He knew the house was not haunted by spirits. It was haunted by physics and emotion, captured and weaponized by his brilliant, insane great-uncle. His logical, predictable world was falling apart, one reverberating scream at a time. The Bramha House was less an architectural structure and more an instrument of torture, patiently waiting for a new occupant to harvest and amplify their own fear. Rishabh's intellectual curiosity, the very tool that had built his career, now became his undoing. He couldn't leave the house. The sheer audacity of his great-uncle's genius, however mad, held him captive. He spent the next week systematically mapping the echo zones. He used sophisticated sound-measuring equipment he had driven back from the city to track the precise locations where the emotional residue was strongest. He found a small, sealed cavity in the wall of the main hallway. When he pried it open, he didn't find wiring or pipes, but a desiccated clump of human hair and a child's tooth. The moment he exposed the cavity, the hallway was saturated not with pain, but with pure, paralyzing grief. It felt like the sudden, crushing realization of a permanent, catastrophic loss, a wave of despair so heavy that Rishabh sank to his knees, unable to breathe. He had to get help, not to fight the house, but to confirm his sanity. He called his younger sister, Anya, a pragmatic journalist who, conveniently, specialized in debunking urban myths. He gave her a sanitized version of the truth, an old house, strange acoustics, and a sudden, intense bout of anxiety. Anya, concerned by her brother's strained voice, agreed to drive up and spend a weekend. He tried to clean the house, to neutralize the atmosphere, but the dust seemed to return instantly, and the shadows deepened whenever he looked away. He warned Anya about the odd acoustics but deliberately kept the worst of his discoveries hidden, determined to prove the phenomenon using her as a control subject. Anya arrived 2 days later, bringing a blast of outside air and logic that felt momentarily cleansing. She laughed at the house, calling it architectural arrogance. Her skepticism was a solid, comforting counterweight to the house's growing psychic weight. For the first day, the house seemed quiet, almost waiting. The echoes were dormant, perhaps overwhelmed by her strong, vibrant presence. Rishabh started to relax, thinking his mind had played a trick on him, that his fatigue had led to a psychological break. He planned to leave with her the next morning. But the house wasn't broken, it was learning. That evening, as Anya was preparing dinner in the kitchen, the zone where the ceramic mug had shattered, Rishabh was upstairs. He heard the unmistakable sound of a knife hitting the slate floor. Not a metallic clatter, but the heavy, dull thud of a blade. He rushed down. Anya was standing perfectly still, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. The kitchen was dark. "Anya, what happened? Did you drop something?" he asked, his voice tight. She slowly turned. Her face was pale, and her eyes were fixed on the floor where a chef's knife lay. "I didn't drop it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It fell off the counter. And when it hit the ground, I didn't hear a clatter. I heard someone moan." That was the turning point. The echoes were no longer just replays of sound or emotion, they were layering, synthesizing, and gaining context. Anya's initial fear of the sudden, unexplained movement was layered with the despair trapped in the nearby dining room, manifesting as a sound of human pain. The house was now customizing the terror for the current occupant's companion. Anya was terrified, but her journalistic instinct kicked in. She insisted they investigate Arjun Varma's journals together, finding a strange courage in confronting the facts. Together, they discovered Arjun's final, horrifying project. The basement, the room lined with sound-dampening material, was not a drain. It was the centerpiece of the house. Arjun's later journals revealed he had realized the emotional echoes, once trapped, would eventually consolidate into a single, highly charged, and sentient psychic mass. He called it the resonance core. The black, sound-dampening walls were not there to quiet the core, but to contain its voice. The single bolted chair in the middle of the room was where Arjun intended to sit during the final stages of the project, to experience the ultimate resonance, the culmination of all human suffering. But he never finished the ritual. The journal ended mid-sentence, the handwriting dissolving into a chaotic scrawl of repeated circles. The horror in the house amplified its efforts to drive them away from the truth. That night, as they huddled in the study, reading the terrifying entries, the lights began to strobe rapidly, not flickering, but flashing with precision. The sound was not electricity, but a sustained, unbearable high-pitched whimper that felt like it was tearing at the inside of their skulls. Rishabh recognized the frequency. It was the concentrated sound of pure, helpless anxiety trapped in the utility room below. Anya covered her ears, weeping, a victim of the building's deliberate psychological warfare. Rishabh realized the full terror of the situation. The house was a living, sentient battery of misery. By investigating the basement, they were threatening the resonance core's containment. The core was pushing back, using the house's acoustic properties to force them out or, worse, to break them down enough to become its new source of energy. Rishabh, however, felt a strange, cold detachment. The waves of fear and grief that battered Anya barely touched him. He was becoming immune, having been the primary host for weeks. This immunity, he realized, was his great-uncle's ultimate goal, to train the next architect to withstand the psychological assault long enough to complete the final, unknown stage of the ritual. He was becoming the perfect custodian of the suffering. He looked at his terrified sister, then at the sealed basement door. The house was pushing them towards the truth, but the truth lay in the silent, terrifying heart of the core. They had a choice: flee and forfeit the house, or descend into the absolute silence of the basement and confront the entity forged from every scream, rage, and heartbreak the Bramha House had ever contained. The whimpering stopped abruptly, replaced by the profound, deafening silence that always followed the house's concentrated assaults. Anya was sobbing, huddled against Rishabh, her logical mind shattered by the focused psychic trauma. But Rishabh felt nothing but a cold, clinical curiosity. The emotional shielding he had developed over weeks of exposure was now absolute. He looked at his crying sister with a strange detachment, like watching a video playback of raw human grief. He knew then that the house had successfully molded him, making him immune to everything but the core itself. He was ready to face the finality of his great-uncle's legacy. He had to go to the basement. He helped Anya to the couch, wrapped her in a thick blanket, and gave her a heavy dose of the mild sedatives the lawyer had left. "I'm going to the basement," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of the tremor Anya still possessed. I need to understand the source of the acoustic pattern. Anya, lost in a fog of fear and medication, only managed a weak, pleading shake of the head. Rishabh ignored it. He was operating on pure, cold purpose. He took the heavy iron key that opened the basement door and descended into the laundry room. The basement door was thick oak, reinforced with iron. It creaked open, revealing the void. Rishabh shone his powerful flashlight down the concrete steps. The air was colder here, heavier, and completely, impossibly silent. It was a silence that felt like pressure, a physical lack of vibration that strained the eardrums. He remembered Arjun's journal. The entire space was lined with a sound-dampening, dull black material, the only room in the house not built for resonance, but for containment. Rishabh reached the bottom. The flashlight beam cut across the vast, circular stone chamber, confirming the journal's description. Black, thick, synthetic material covered every surface. In the center, bolted to the stone floor, was the tall-backed, black wooden chair, the core's intended focus point. There were no cobwebs, no dust, and no rats. The room was sterile, preserved in the moment of its final construction, waiting for its terrifying purpose to be realized. As he walked toward the chair, his footsteps made no sound. They were swallowed instantly by the black lining. The only noise was the sharp intake of his own breath and the frantic, internal beat of his own heart, which seemed amplified to a thunderous roar inside the absolute quiet. The silence was the real weapon here. It severed the mind from the outside world, leaving it alone with its own deepest fears. The cold detachment that had shielded him upstairs began to crack. Without the external acoustic distraction, his internal thoughts were all he had. He reached the chair. It was imposing, built for a man to sit upright, facing the single, sealed wall where the stone was thickest. He moved his light over the black lining. It wasn't fabric, it was a dense composite material, impossibly layered. He ran his hand over it. It felt slick and slightly warm, pulsing with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. The material was vibrating, not from sound, but from the massive emotional energy pressing against it from the inside. Then, the core spoke. It did not use sound. It communicated directly through pressure on Rishabh's internal organs, a terrifying, psychic squeeze that made him drop the flashlight. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint, weak light spilling from the laundry room door above. The pressure grew, and with it came the emotions of the core. It wasn't the distinct rage or grief of the upper rooms. This was a unified, crushing wave of pure, distilled horror. The fear of every soul who had ever suffered in the Bramha House, condensed into a single, overwhelming psychic mass. Rishabh sank to his knees, his hands pressed uselessly against his temples. He saw visions not with his eyes, but with his mind, the terrified, final moments of the boy in the attic, the agonizing despair of the man in the library, the blinding fury of the relative in the hallway. They were all there, a screaming mosaic of absolute agony, demanding to be let out. The core wanted release. It wanted to infect the world outside, and it saw Rishabh, the highly trained, detached architect, as the perfect conduit. The core's will entered his mind, clear and absolute, sit in the chair. Complete the circuit. Open the gate. Rishabh fought back with the only weapon he possessed, his rigid, architectural logic. "You are vibration," he gasped, his voice a strained whisper in the vast, silent room. "You are contained energy. You are not a god. You are an overload." He tried to crawl back, but the pressure intensified, squeezing the air from his lungs. The core was not fighting him with ghosts or noises, it was fighting him with the psychological weight of his own family's history of suffering. Then, the final, customized terror surfaced, the ultimate fear his great-uncle had predicted. It was not death or pain. It was the fear of failing to complete the project. The core knew Rishabh's deepest obsession was perfection, order, and finishing what he started. It showed him an alternate reality, himself, years later, a broken, drooling madman, unable to draw a straight line, living in the city, haunted by the single, unfinished project in the mountains. The failure was worse than the terror. The incomplete design, the abandoned legacy. Rishabh stared into the suffocating darkness, paralyzed not by fear, but by the agonizing vision of his own professional ruin. The black chair beckoned, a cold, silent throne waiting for the man whose desire for completion had just outweighed his instinct for survival. The core was winning. The architect was about to surrender to the ultimate, silent horror of the Bramha House. The sheer force of the core's psychological attack was overwhelming. Rishabh was moments from breaking, his hands inching towards the obsidian black chair. The vision of professional failure, the incomplete blueprints, the abandoned structure, the chaotic end to his meticulously ordered life was a terror worse than any spectral scream. He felt the entity's power consolidating, drawing him inward, eager to claim its new, perfect host. The core wasn't just a container of fear, it was the ultimate architectural parasite, ready to integrate his consciousness and intellect into its being. Just as his fingers brushed the cold, bolted armrest of the chair, a pure, external sound shattered the suffocating psychic pressure. It was a rhythmic, frantic thudding from the steps above, followed by a voice, muffled but desperate, "Rishabh, get out of there. Please. Anya." The sedatives had failed to keep her quiet. Her voice, raw with fear but tethered to the outside world, was a lifeline. The sound, any sound, was a poison to the core's silent ritual. The pressure on Rishabh's mind momentarily fractured. He gasped, sucking in a lungful of cold air. He looked up toward the faint light of the open basement door. The core reacted instantly, not with fear, but with concentrated rage. It understood the threat of the untainted outside world. The air in the basement, which had been silent, was suddenly filled with a low, bone-shaking drone, a frequency so deep it rattled the teeth in his jaw. The black lining on the walls began to shimmer and pulsate, straining against the trapped energy. The core shifted its focus, launching a quick, furious mental blast toward the stairs, intent on silencing the intruder. Rishabh realized Anya was in immediate, fatal danger. If the core broke containment now, the sheer psychic violence would instantly destroy her mind. His architect's brain, still capable of cold calculation, seized on one final, desperate option. The core was contained vibration. Its exit was the weakest point, the open basement door. The energy was psychic, but its container was physical. Ignoring the core's furious pressure, Rishabh stumbled backward, crawling past the chair and toward the thick, outer stone wall, the single sealed wall where Arjun Varma had meant for the energy to be permanently contained. He grabbed a loose piece of jagged slate from the floor, his hands shredded by the effort. With a primal surge of adrenaline, he began to strike the black containment lining. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The blows were muffled by the material, but the physical force was directed at the integrity of the containment. The black lining began to tear. The core roared a soundless, deafening wave of psychic terror that threw Rishabh back against the far wall. The air felt like a superheated vacuum. He looked at the tear he had created. It was small, no more than a foot wide, but through the opening, he could see the grey, solid stone behind the lining. The core's rage was now solely directed at the hole. It was a breach, a flaw in the perfect architectural trap. The massive, contained psychic energy began to drain through the tiny opening, drawn to the solid, unlined bedrock of the earth itself. The energy didn't escape, it flowed into the stone, dispersing harmlessly into the physical foundations of the house. As the core drained, the crushing pressure on Rishabh's mind eased. The phantom screams subsided. The terror was replaced by a profound emptiness, a silence so complete it was sickening. He looked up. Anya was still at the top of the stairs, trembling but alive. Rishabh Varma was left sitting on the basement floor, alive and sane, but fundamentally changed. The house had been emptied, neutralized. The Bramha House was now structurally sound, acoustically perfect, and entirely benign. He had finished the project, but not in the way his great-uncle intended. He had used the principles of architecture to disperse the terror, not amplify it. They left the next morning. Anya was still traumatized, but she never saw the shadows again. She knew only that the house was a place of terrible, unexplained things. Rishabh, however, carried the truth. He claimed the inheritance, sold the Bramha House to a wealthy, unsuspecting developer, and never returned to his profession. He could no longer tolerate the predictability of lines and angles. The moral victory was his, but the consequence was lifelong. He had experienced the absolute horror of pure, distilled human suffering, and his meticulously ordered mind was scarred by the memory of the cause terror. He had destroyed the architectural flaw, but in doing so, he had achieved his great-uncle's true, terrifying goal, the perfect emotional immunity. Rishabh Varma, the architect who loved order, could no longer feel deeply. The man who had been terrified of chaos now lived in a state of perpetual, cold, emotional neutrality. He saved his sister and defeated the house, but the cost was his own warmth and humanity. He walked the earth, a shell of perfect composure, an architect of emptiness, forever haunted not by the echo of a scream, but by the echo of silence where his feelings used to be. The Bramha House was silenced, but Rishabh Varma was its final, unfeeling masterpiece.